Episode 3 of the Better SMB podcast. Today we're having a fireside chat with Simon Walker. Who is Simon, you ask? Well, at the time of our chat, Simon had just sold Proposition after 9 years and now is a strategy advisor for systems advisory services. Simon brings an amazing collection of experience, learning and observation and what could make the New Zealand SME sector match that of other high-performing countries. We go into big ideas and then down to little nuggets for SMB owners. It is really a conversation that covered just about everything. David and I really enjoyed having a guest take the spotlight today. I hope you do as well. That's enough from me. On with the podcast.
I'd like to welcome Simon Walker to the podcast. Simon, CEO at Proposition Group, and I see after 9 years you have just announced on LinkedIn that you have made an exit from that business.
I have.
And you're going to spend time on the couch reflecting and exploring what's next.
And by time on the couch reflecting and exploring what's next, I sort of mean watching the NBA playoffs. But I didn't think it would sound so professional to be that explicit on LinkedIn, you know.
You got to do what you got to do, right? So we connected through the work that you were doing with Proposition Group with tech vendors.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
we spent some time discussing the productivity subject off the back of the work I was doing on my MBA. And I've been watching this random hashtag start showing up, ID 2070. And it's making its way into your content and someone that you're associated with. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I can. I think I've done a bit of work on it. The whole idea of ID 2070 probably starts a little before we get to why we called it ID 2070, right? So over the last 24 months, I've been thinking about why are we unable to do nice things for ourselves here? Why do we find ourselves constantly arguing over cents when we should be focusing on dollars? Why is doing things difficult? Why does it feel difficult to make growth-oriented progress? And that sort of starting point led me down a few different paths, one of which is looking at, obviously New Zealand's economy is dominated by primary industries, dominated by milk powder on an export scale. And is that something that's sustainable? Is that actually a viable wealth creation model? That obviously, that's led me down a few different pathways. One of which is to say, well, actually is productivity about how smart we are at what we do, which is the denominator of the productivity equation, how good we are at making the stuff that we are here to make in the time we have available? Or is it actually our productivity problem about the numerator, which is the value of the stuff that we sell in the time we have to make it? Doesn't matter how good you are at making something if you can only sell it at a global commodity price, which is what we've seen with farming, and it's why all our eggs in that basket hasn't worked. So that was kind of the first bit. The second bit was, okay, well, now we've got that. What comparable things can we look at overseas? I just am so lucky enough to have an Irish wife, and we go to Ireland once a year. And we were there in August last year, and I just found myself lamenting while on the Lewis, which is the Dublin light rail, on the Lewis home from the Irish pub, or the pub as they just call it in Ireland. And I was on the Lewis and I was just sitting there thinking, I just wish I could catch the bloody light rail up Dominion Road from my house to the Irish pub and back. Why can't we do that? And then I got back here in late August into an election campaign that fundamentally seemed to be an argument over the allocation of finite resources rather than how we grow the pie for everybody. So I started doing some more digging into that and found out all these horrific stats, like our real GNP per capita hasn't gone anywhere in the last 5 years. In fact, we're probably getting poorer on average as a person in New Zealand than richer in real terms, which is obviously super important because the numbers look quite good when you do nominal ones because of inflation. Why is all this stuff happening? And that kind of brought me back to this it's about the numerator of the equation, not about the denominator of the equation. And then finally, and this is the guy who you were obviously talking about when you said contact of ours, started talking to Kerry about this. We have a monthly coffee at Cornwall Park, which is great because I get to tell him that he has to come to the home of the best cricket club in Auckland to have a coffee with me. But we started talking about this, and we started kind of exploring the idea of what's the actual problem here? Is the problem that we don't know what we sell or who we sell it to? Well, yes, that's part of it. But is actually the part of where we struck is that what we don't have in New Zealand is an economic identity. And an economic identity, I think, is a really important part of an identity as to who we are as a people. And so that's where the ID comes from, right? The 2070 comes from my favorite working example, which is Ireland. 1973, Ireland joined the European Union and was on the bones of its ass economically. You know, it's a country that relied on farming, that relied on exporting primary produce, that had obviously a very complex history, but had really struggled to make ends meet doing that on a global scale. 50 years later, I'm in Dublin and I'm riding my light rail and everything's looking really positive for Ireland. It's not a perfect country, but really positive. So the 2070 literally comes from 50 years because that's what it takes to actually deliver on the promise of a vision like this, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. We don't get to say, oh, we want to be more like Silicon Valley. We're going to be more like Silicon Valley next year. The systems, the ecosystems, the relationships, the capital, the businesses, the skills, everything takes a lot of time to develop. So we have to have a 50-year vision. And then the last part of that became, well, how do we turn that into an actionable insight, an actionable unit that we deliver on a really short-term basis? So we're constantly making momentum towards that without necessarily having to come up with this big plan that in a waterfall chart, which Rob will hate me talking about, but in a big we don't have to have a big waterfall chart that says, here is how New Zealand is going to be rich in 50 years starting from today. Because that's obviously not going to work, because if there's one thing I know, it's that I don't know everything. And there's no way we can possibly predict what's going to happen in 12 months' time, let alone 40 years' time. So that's kind of the genesis of ID 2070. And it's been honestly one of the coolest things I've ever done, starting to talk about this with people and starting to use some of the storytelling that I brought out of the business to take people on a bit of a different journey rather than one of complaining that things aren't what we want them to be.
Nice. I'm curious on your business. So, you founded your business 9 years ago. You've grown that. I take it was yourself, and did you have business partners or anyone along those lines?
Yeah, so I started the business with a business partner, and we worked together in our previous roles. It wasn't for him, so he left after about 18 months, and we. It's funny, right? When you've exited it, you look back at all these times where it's like, maybe I should have stopped then. Why didn't I stop then? I often just didn't think. I just didn't really give myself that option for a lot of times. But yeah, so I started it with him. He left 18 months in, and so for the last 8 years, 7.5 years, I've really run Proposition by myself, which has been a really interesting journey. I was 28 when he left the business, so pretty young, and I've had to learn a huge amount about myself, about work, about people, about entrepreneurship, about zero to be able to do this. And it's been a really interesting experience.
What are some of the great lessons you've kind of taken away from that? Because Proposition's carrying on with new ownership or whatever, right?
Yeah, so we've had a nice, we've been able to put together a really nice deal. Obviously, 2024 is not the most wonderful time to sell a marketing agency, but we've been able to put some stuff that works well together for the clients and the people, which is what really matters to me, right? That's been the most important thing. What are some personal lessons? So the biggest one that I've been kind of cogitating on for the last couple of months, 3 months is, and I think this has some real interesting applications in the New Zealand context, is what's the opportunity cost of what you're doing compared to what the real return on your skills or time could be? And I think when you start a business and when it's yours and when you have a lot of identity tied up in it, it's really difficult to ask yourself those brutal kinds of questions, right? And it is something that is very hard to, and maybe once you start to think about, well, maybe it's time for me to go and do something different, it becomes a little easier to have that discussion with yourself. Have I achieved the maximum possible economic return on my time and skills for the last 9 years? Probably, definitely for the first 5. I learned a lot, but over the last 4, has the structure that I built over the first 5 been the right structure for me to be able to prosecute what I wanted to do, both economically and as a human, right? So that's been one of my lessons. And it's a really difficult question to ask, but I think it's an important one. Another lesson is that you have no idea how much you don't know when you start, but if you knew, you wouldn't start. We talk all the time about grit and resilience and toughness, and you've just got to embrace the fact that it's going to be a learning journey and that there's going to be a whole pile of things that you don't know, and that no one expects you to know everything. Right? Because again, I was young and full of ego and wanted to tell everybody show everybody how good I was, and that actually I didn't need to know everything, and that what I needed to do was admit that I didn't know everything and ask for help. And that's often how you solve that problem, with a bit of vulnerability, which comes with experience and age. And third thing is that, like, the first Excel spreadsheet you should create when you start a business is your cash flow forecast before you even set up your email. And then you should never, ever, ever go another day without looking at it again, because until you have a CFO working for you, that is your job. It's yours. In fact, even once you have a CFO working for you, that's your job. That's your responsibility, and the buck stops with you there. And that until you're willing to be, and that takes a real kind of commitment, because often as an entrepreneur, that's not what you want to be doing. You don't want to be sitting there looking at your cash flows. You want to be out there talking to your customers or building your product or doing all the cool shit that is why you got into the business in the first place. But if you don't do that, and you don't do that honestly, you'll make everything else really hard for yourself.
Those are really cool. So if I'm doing my maths right, you're now mid-30s. You've jumped into entrepreneurship. You've built a team around you. Having a quick look at proposition, 10, 20, somewhere around that kind of number, team members?
Yeah, so we had 9 this year. But we've had 25 people through the company over the last 9 years, which has been really cool. And honestly, like, going and watching them grow and watching them develop skills has been way cooler than anything I've achieved personally, individually.
So you talked about going from the CEO, the Chief Everything Officer, to the CEO. I've got a CFO now. I've got team members who are doing things. How was that journey? Like, you talked about the first 5 years being, you're smashing it, and then the last 4 being a little bit different. But how did you find building that team? I'm asking this because my perception of the SME landscape is businesses of the size of the business you grew, people who are struggling to let go, right? And you've managed to let go to a certain extent.
Yeah. So I never had a CFO. I had pretty much everything else. But I was always the numbers guy, unfortunately, because I got a C- in Maths 108, and that's where my maths career stopped.
Karma.
I mean, 8 a.m. lectures were never a good idea in the first place. But I think the first 5 years was very much about me dragging the team. It was like I was the head builder and they were just my laborers. They were really good. That's probably a little bit of a harsh analogy. They were all really good people, but that's how I ran it. It was my ideas. It was my thing. It was, we do things my way and you help and support, which is super hard and super stressful. The start of what would it have been? Year 6, I joined an organization called the Entrepreneurs Organization in their accelerator program. And just a big plug for that program for anybody who's trying to scale a business, because it really helped me see through some of the limiting beliefs, the tools that I needed, all of the sort of stuff that was holding me back from scaling the business. And what I quite quickly realized is that I was absolutely, totally unscalable as an individual. I like work, but I'm not to the point where I'm willing to do 105 hours a week and never see any of my friends and completely devote myself to my company. I want to have balance. So to scale a company to the size that I wanted to scale when I was thinking about this, without effectively doing that, I needed to find a way to let go and develop other people around me. It's been a real hard and interesting journey. You don't get it right. I'd actually never had a direct report until I was employing people myself. So I was like, shit, what do I do here now? My corporate manager used to go out for a one-on-one coffee with me once a month. Okay, well, we'll start by doing that and maybe read some LinkedIn posts or some books, and very ad hoc. The two things that I think really stuck out to me are your job's to set people up to succeed, right? Your job is to make sure that the process, the systems, the tools, the know-how, everything's sitting there so that when someone comes into work, they can pick those things up and go and do the job that you've given them. So if you can go, if they can do that, then they can go and be fulfilled, right? No one comes into work to do a bad job. That most people just struggle to find the right tools or the right things, and be really clear with what you expect. Second, and I was not good at that when I started doing it. I was really good at saying, here, I have an idea, you can execute that. And that's like a classic example of the principal agent problem. That's a bit of microeconomics. People who work for you don't behave like people who own businesses, and you can't expect them to. But then the second part to that is, once you've got all of those things, trust is given, not earned, right? People into a high trust environment, they tend to behave with high trust. If you hire people into an environment where you say, you're here now, but you've got to prove yourself and you've got to show me why I should trust you, then generally people are going to get pretty shitty with you pretty fast, and it's going to be a really tough road to hoe.
The things that you've just talked about, Simon, and I've got two questions. I'll start with the second one, really, is you're describing a leadership that demonstrates and role models learning and being inquisitive, right?
Yeah.
And generally overall business capability. And this goes back to David and I have had chat about this many times now, that whole E-Myth book, specialists go in, run a business because, I was good as a technician.
Yeah.
I think both of that, certainly from what I see on the coalface around New Zealand and SMEs and different sectors and service industries, manufacturing, engineering, construction, all of that, that is severely lacking. Like if we had the bell curve, you're at the end. David's at the end because he's learning. He wants to be inquisitive and he brings that kind of style of leadership. When we drag this conversation back to productivity and why that whole SME performance isn't being lifted, what can we do to sort of push, and maybe this might be what happened in Ireland, but push that overall capability in our business leaders, SME leaders, and going that it's okay to be not the fountain of knowledge for everything, and creating and certainly lifting up that business maturity, that ownership, that leadership maturity and capability, because that's where I see 80% of our problems in SMEs in New Zealand.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one of the first knee jerks that springs to mind is that New Zealand's one of the easiest countries in the world. We love to say that we're the easiest country in the world to start a company. I don't necessarily know if that's a good thing, right? It means that practitioners end up running companies that scale to the point of their sort of practitioner management ability quite quickly, but then get stuck. And coming back to opportunity cost, there's an opportunity cost to that, right? Because then you've got somebody who's both smart, motivated, risk-taking, doing something that's not really scaling further, but they feel a bit trapped and they feel a bit stuck in it. And that's super demotivating. Nothing kills ambition like getting stuck at a ceiling, right? Nothing kills ambition like that. And often, you speak to people who are at the start of the journey and they're super ambitious and they have all these big goals and they want to grow. And then they get stuck on that ceiling, and then they're like a helium balloon that's been stuck up on the ceiling for, the last 20 years. And the business is still a similar size and it's delivered them a good outcome, but it's a very high risk job.
I'm just going to say it's not even a ceiling, because what I see is poorly run businesses that even aren't profitable. They're awesome ideas, but they're just poorly run. So they're not even hitting the ceiling capability.
Yeah.
And because I agree with you, it's so easy to, we've all mentioned this, I can create a business tonight and be up and running tomorrow. I don't think we even hit the ceiling in a lot of those SMEs.
Yeah, and so, like, where do you start, right? Do you start at the macro, which is that we struggle to drive economic growth in general? Or do you start at the micro, which is that we need to build business capability and entrepreneurship and ambition and skills? The answer is probably some combination of both. The macro is super important, because if we can't keep if we can't get the economy growing, start growing our national wealth consistently, we will struggle to deliver growth for businesses. But
so on that, I'll just butt in because I know
Yeah,
you're
sure.
in full mode. At that macro point of view, productivity as a political football, do we need to really start educating politicians exactly what productivity is, so they have because every left or right, they have a different view of the elephant. And
Yeah.
so every 3 years or 6 years, if we're lucky, we get a consistent strand. And at least even if you don't agree with the viewpoint, at least it's a consistent approach.
Yeah.
Whereas, so we've got such a diverse, and I truly don't think it's fully understood in Wellington.
I agree. So I think part of that comes back to the identity problem we talked about right at the start, right? Like we don't know if you don't know where you're going, it's really hard to provide. If I know where I'm going, if my wife and I know where we're going on a road trip, we can have different ideas about how we want to get there, which way we want to drive. But our end goal is to get to the same place. New Zealand is on a road trip without an end destination, and that's the economic identity piece. The other question I have is, does the word productivity mean what we need it to mean from an economics perspective in New Zealand? And I've been thinking about this quite a bit because words are important, and the way you communicate things is really important. Productivity from an economics concept is, the amount of value you create per hour worked or per unit of labor inputted, which is super clear and super obvious and super easy. But when we start to speak about being productive in society, we start to talk about how focused I am, or how many MS Teams notifications I get in an hour, or whether I'm paying attention at work. And so all of the conversation about being productive, the work optimization side of the equation, and we don't have, so when we talk about productivity, we don't talk about, okay, what do we sell? We talk about, or how are we going to teach people how to code so they can make software product better? Or, how are we going to upskill our builders so that they can cut wood faster? Which is like the absolute wrong question, because if you want to change a fraction, you have to massively change the numerator, not the denominator.
Which is what Ireland did.
Which is what Ireland did.
How did you measure productivity in your business?
With difficulty would be the honest answer. And I always copped out and used the creative industries excuse for this, right? So it was like, oh, we're creative, we want to measure output, but it's really hard to measure output by value. All this, we kind of got to this point where it was, we debated ourselves into an absolute knot over how do we measure productivity. And where we ended up sitting down as a leadership team and agreeing what we needed to measure was, we needed to measure, and I didn't love it because it felt old school and inelegant, but we needed to measure the utilization percentage of our team, right? We needed to say, how much of the time that you spend working with us is spent on billable time, because that's the only way we can truly know whether you are moving us forward economically as a resource. I hate that measure because I feel like it's so inelegant, but we said, we've got to measure, we can look at all the soft stuff, we can work at all the soft stuff, but that core utilization measure is what we need to measure productivity in terms of, and not productivity in terms of output, but productivity in terms of value creation.
Then you mentioned the words I was going to say, because if you're measuring the utilization piece, that's ultimately, it's the denominator, right? But then you're able to focus on, and as a marketing business, this is in your wheelhouse. What is the value we're creating? Which then allows you to focus on those soft pieces to drive the value discussion with your clients.
Yeah, this is part of the reason why it's such a tough business, because often the value you create for your clients happens quite a long time after you do the work. And we are so tied to a time for money model of service delivery that we don't really get to experience the economic value that we create, because we don't create it in the short term, we create it in the long run, right?
50 years, right?
50 years, but even 12 months, right? And it's really hard to convince someone to pay a bigger invoice when it's like the opposite of that, the story about the guy who goes onto the ship and hits the engine with the one hammer and the itemized invoice, and it's 10 grand for my experience and $2 for the hammer kind of thing. It's the opposite of that. It's like, it's 10 grand for my experience, But instead of having a motor running right now in your ship, wait 12 months and watch the magic happen. And when you've got a lot of businesses that aren't on the foils, operating at real efficiency, driving real good returns, 12 months is a long time to wait, man, to pay value for stuff. So the way I kind of always looked at it was that we needed to figure it out. We needed to find a way to unhook our billing from the time that we spent now. And that was always that's, I think, a real challenge for services businesses, because it's easy to start by billing for your time. And we're a marketing agency that was pretty good at telling stories, but we really struggled to tell the story of value pricing with our customer and our customers in our market. We never really got there. And that's the economic, that's the numerator, and we struggle with it.
That whole definition of productivity is Carl Newport in his book, The Slow Productivity, really described that and really honed in on that in the creative space, in that sort of tech space. Even goes back to, artists will go on retreats, or Madame Curie would go on a 4-month retreat at the lakes in Switzerland, but then come back and then bang, 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 outputs really quickly. Because going back to your measurement, absolutely crude. I agree. It's totally not a functional one. I've challenged clients with this very similar measurement and going, well, that doesn't actually tell us about quality, or are they doing a good job? Because I could be on billable time, but I'm just taking my jolly good time to achieve it. And I think that's possibly where our now defunct Productivity Commission missed a big opportunity, is to open up the discussion about what this definition is for different sectors. And it's okay to measure, but that goes also back to our maturity and our SMEs. Like agriculture is actually 9th on our GDP percentage. If you bring all the manufacturing together, it's well above agriculture. And yet we all focus on this one industry in New Zealand. And it goes back to that whole identity crisis topic that we had. It's like agriculture, it's a sinking number in terms of our GDP.
But it's a big driver of export
measure
earnings,
the value and the quality of all of that.
Yeah, absolutely right. So quality's a really hard thing to measure. Like literally, we played around with this idea of measuring our productivity based on customers sending us fan mail. Like we were trying to find anything that felt like it was delivering where we felt value was, which was in great customer experiences where they were super happy. We have to figure out a way to reframe the conversation, because New Zealanders love talking about how hard we work and we hate talking about how successful we want to be. And the denominator of the equation is all about how hard we work, and we're safe there. And the numerator is actually admitting that you want to build wealth. And we have to find a different way to have that conversation, because at the moment, if I turn around and say, if someone says, well, why are you here? And I say, well, because I want to do a $20 million exit one day, they look at me and go, back in your box.
Yet we expect that high achievement in our sport, and where that's one of our identities. All Blacks, America's Cup, all of that kind of stuff.
And you could do it with egalitarianism. Like Richie McCaw's All Blacks were one of the most egalitarian professional sporting sides ever. But you don't win the World Cup without being ruthlessly ambitious. You don't turn up. You don't do the little things you need to do to turn up to training. Just because you're egalitarian doesn't stop you from being ambitious. It's a big myth.
Why can't we translate that thinking and that mindset into the business, in the sort of our business and SME world?
I honestly, this is something I struggle with, right? Like I struggle to figure out. I think it's just, there's a bit of cultural stuff. There's a bit of confidence, right? There's probably a lack of growth in our export markets for everything, pretty much everything. SaaS is going okay. 77%, while to your point, agriculture is not the biggest share of our GDP. It's the biggest share of our foreign earnings. And I've kind of come to the conclusion, and just to massively pivot to the macro for a second, that foreign earnings, i.e. trade, are actually the way more important economic indicator than GDP, because GDP happens as a result. In a global world, the only way you can make the economy go faster is by doing two things: print more money or make more money. And to make more money, you have to make more money from trade. And so all of the other stuff that happens in an economy happens as a result of getting your exports right.
And is that flipping the story? To get the exports right, we have to have a smart SME community to support the 10% that are creating that wealth and creating the export. Going from that macro and micro conversation you had earlier is, we need a bit of both.
We need a bit of both. And like, I'm a marketer, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a storyteller, and I'm a salesman. I like to make generalizations. There's nuance to all of this conversation, and the real answer is both. And then the how is a whole pile of stuff. But for me, it comes from things like, we need to be more demanding of excellence when we buy from customers here. We can't accept mediocrity, right? It starts by changing the minds and the way that we behave for a few people. It starts by saying, actually, we've got a group that's ambitious, that's quality-minded, and that's going to breed more ambitious, quality-minded businesses, right? There's 70,000 businesses between 10 and 100 employees in New Zealand, or something like that. We don't need all of them to change. We just need enough of them to change that. And to your point, every time they touch a supplier that's not on that journey, they say, hey, we need you on this journey with us, or we need to find a different solution. And we have to figure out how we create those standards, because it took me a while to realize that was the expectation that I needed to set. Like, when you incorporate a company, you should be sent a copy of Steve Jobs' biography by Walter Isaacson, not because Steve Jobs is the best dude ever or because he was the best businessman ever, but because what was really clear from that for me is his commitment to quality and how that drove outcomes for the business everywhere he went. And you can't be the best, even if you're the best in a niche, you can't be the best unless you have an unyielding commitment to excellence. And to do that, you've got to be passionate, and to do that, you've got to be focused and driven. And that's kind of like a self-selector for a lot of the stuff that we're talking about.
And also, I always go back to the same point. To do that, we need a bit of maturity and understanding in our business leaders, because I don't even think that even for 50% of them out there, that they know that even aware that this world is out there, that you can do something different at a higher quality. They just keep doing what they've seen generation after generation.
And that's a nice return to storytelling, right? Because we hold Richie McCaw up as like the greatest New Zealander who ever lived. We hold Sir Edmund Hillary up as the greatest New Zealander who ever lived. But there have been some people that I've kind of discovered through reading about this that have done some amazing stuff in this country that we don't ever talk about, right? And we need to tell their stories as well. Like, the Gallagher business is a great example. I posted about Gallagher's on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and half the Aucklanders were like, oh, that's what that business that has that big office on the outskirts of Hamilton does. We didn't know. Someone was like, I thought they were a casino. Their logo, it was a big black glassy building, and the logo looks like a casino chip. Auckland is not Gallagher's target market for their products and services, and that's fine. But Gallagher's...
They probably are, when they realise that Gallagher's made probably 50 to 60% of the petrol pumps in every Z and Shell station, right? But you just don't know that they do that.
Right? You have to tell New Zealanders, and especially our business owners, the stories of ambition and excellence with getting it right. You have to say, this person did good, and this is what good looks like, and this is how they got there. And we have to start beating that drum to tell our kids and our young people that it's possible, and to inspire the belief in ourselves, right? Cricket example, because it wouldn't be a podcast if I didn't use a cricket example.
Don't use Cornwall Park, sure, no.
I already did mention that with Kerry, but anyway, right? My dad took me along to the 1992 Cricket World Cup. I was 4. What did I do for the next 30 years of my life? Wanted to play for the Black Caps, because I had heroes right in front of me. In fact, I probably wanted to play for Pakistan at the start, but we'll forget that. Heroes right there in front of me that I could see doing things that I wanted to do. We don't do that with our business leaders. Like Sir Peter Beck's commitment to excellence and what he's done is so precious. But instead of getting him out in front of everybody, he goes and speaks to an audience at Parliament in the theaterette that is very curated, that is very, if you know, you know. And none of those people are ever going to be Peter Beck, because they don't want to be Peter Beck. They just want to be around Peter Beck. We need to put Peter Beck in front of the people who are going to be the next Peter Beck, and other examples as well. But that's topical.
Right. So we give you a magic wand.
Yes.
What are you going to do to fix this and head us on the right path towards that ID 2070 vision?
So I'm going to stay away from government stuff. I posted before the budget about some stuff the government could do without spending any money. Government, so we'll stay away from that. What am I going to do? I have a magic wand. I'm going to start a storytelling program predominantly focused on New Zealand's mid-size or 10 to 200 person business owners. That's focused on not telling them how to do anything, but just inspiring them, right? Inspiring them that they're actually the cog. They're one of the most crucial cogs that spins the wheel that is our economy, and that we have to get them dreaming and thinking and being ambitious entrepreneurs, which is why they got into the business in the first place, right? And we have to help them recapture that, right? That's the first thing. That's the first thing I'm going to do. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to invite all of our friends in the ASEAN region to come down and work with us to use their capital and their commercial challenges and our IP to create solutions that solve their problems. It's the second thing I'm going to do, because our capital isn't going to do it by ourselves. Because if our capital is given a choice, it will go into a residential house. And the third thing that I will do is I would focus so much more deeply on soft skills development rather than hard skills development. Rather than teaching people how to run a project, teaching people how to work with people and get the best out of them, because teams figure stuff out once, when teams are in a good place, they figure stuff out like you wouldn't believe. And often we're still far too command and control-y. Ironic for a country that hates the word socialism, but we need to figure out how to get people leading people rather than people managing work.
I like it.
And that goes back to the leadership maturity that I was talking about, that capability.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I see some scary examples of that command and control style of SME ownership.
And the one thing I'll say about this, and this is, and I was out at Tāmaki College yesterday. I spent a bit of time today with ASEAN business people and representatives. The three of us in this podcast are all white dudes. We're all obviously known for our empathy. I'm kidding, right? We need to not be afraid of the superpowers of the cultures that are around us. There's some real beauty in the way that a lot of the cultures that surround us in this region, and our own Māori culture and Pacific cultures, everywhere, engage at a human level. And instead of being scared of that, we should embrace it. Not because we're trying to be woke, but because it's profitable to do so.
So, Simon Walker, thank you for your time. Some takeaways for me: ruthless ambition, be demanding of excellence, vision and belief, what you've just touched on, embracing cultural inclusion, developing our soft skills. We're on a road trip. Let's set that destination and make sure it's a place worth going to, right? Enjoy your time on the couch with the NBA. You've definitely earned it. Can't wait to see what's next for you.
Amazing, guys. Thank you very much. Let's go Celtics. Woo! Thank you so much for having me on, guys. Cheers.